The Scream Kings are in no way responsible for any encounters with the paranormal, extraterrestrial abductions, eldritch insanity, hauntings, curses, hexes, demonic possessions, cryptozoological sightings, or any loss of sleep that may result from listening to this podcast.
This is the Scream Kings podcast. I'm Nathaniel Darkish.
And this is Max George, and we have a very, very, very special guest on the podcast today. We would like to introduce Ben Rock to the episode.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be on.
We are just thrilled, and I'm fangirling over in Utah.
Aww.
I'm so excited. Thank you, Ben.
Oh, yeah, it's my pleasure.
Well, so I guess just to get things rolling, who are you? Why should our listeners care that we have you on our show?
Yeah, well, hopefully they care. I started out my career when I was still in film school. Actually, even going back earlier, I started out as a special effects makeup artist in high school.
Awesome.
And I was like way into, Tom Savini and Dick Smith and Rick Baker and all that stuff. And
as you should be.
Yeah, and so I hooked up with a community theater in Orlando and met this woman named Amanda Llewellyn. And when I was in college, she started working for a guy named David Pryor. I don't know if you're familiar with David Pryor or his 30-some movies. But she brought me up to be her assistant, and she kind of trained me to be her assistant. And so I worked on a bunch of, this is in Orlando, Florida, and he was in Mobile, Alabama. And I worked on like 6 or 7 David Pryor projects in Mobile, and I worked on, a bunch of low-budget stuff in the Southeast. The most exciting thing maybe was that I got to go to Thailand and work on Bloodsport 2, again as her assistant. And in about 1997, I was going to film school. I wanted to direct my own stuff, and I quit doing makeup. And that same year, I was asked by a bunch of my film school buddies if I would work on their crazy low budget project. And this story is much longer than I'm making it sound, but I've told it several times before. But that film was the Blair Witch Project, and I was brought on as the production designer.
That's amazing.
And so it was actually about a year before that I started. The first thing they had me do was kind of flesh out a lot of the mythology. They had like a rough sketch of the mythology, and they had me kind of, codify it, name the names, set more dates, get really specific with it, and kind of create the timeline of the overall mythology. And then when they raised that sweet, whatever, $22,000, we all went to Maryland and filmed it for a month, and that was a lot of fun. And and then when that blew up, it opened doors for me. I had moved to LA, so I moved to LA in 1999, and literally the day I arrived in LA was the day after it was bought. Blair Witch was bought at Sundance by Artisan Entertainment, and my whole LA adventure kind of got kicked off. Maybe starting about 6-8 months after that when the movie came out, because up until then nobody gave a crap about it. But when it came out, it opened doors. I wrote Curse of the Blair Witch, which was the Sci-Fi Channel special that preceded the movie coming out, and then Artisan wanted 2 more specials. One that promoted its premiere on Showtime, and that was the first thing I was ever hired to direct, and it was called the Burkittsville 7. And if you want to watch it, I stuck it on my Vimeo because I don't think it's on any of the DVDs or Blu-rays or any of that. So you can find it on my Vimeo. And that is still to this day possibly the weirdest thing I've ever gotten to do in this business. It's pretty out there. It's super weird. Well, what they wanted was a TV special that hyped the Blair Witch premiere on Showtime that did not go back over the Blair Witch mythology any more than it needed to, or anything about the first movie, and they also didn't want to give away the second movie. So I came up with a super oddball pitch, and they went for it, and that was lucky. And then I did another special that was for the ill-fated sequel, and a bunch of other, some other highlights. I did a movie for Warner Brothers called Alien Raiders. I hate the title. Never liked that title. That was stuck on it at the very end. But the movie itself, I'm quite proud of. Came together pretty well. And actually, Dan Myrick, who was the co-director on Blair Witch, he was the executive producer on that. He kind of gave me my first feature, and so far only feature. But yeah, and then I've done a lot. Oh, and my friend Bob DeRosa, who I co-wrote Video Palace with, he and I have a web series we've been doing for about the last 4 or 5 years called 20 Seconds to Live. That's kind of a horror comedy thing that you can find pretty easily. All the episodes thus far are posted on ariescope.com, which is Adam Green's website. But we have a second season coming out, and we're probably going to move the whole show to our website at that time.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's crazy. Blair Witch, we've talked about it quite a bit on the podcast. We don't have a specific episode about it, but that movie is classic.
Oh, thanks.
Terrified me the first time I saw it. And the fact that you actually helped with the mythology, I'm a big kind of mythology religion guru here, so that is
cool.
That's amazing. And the Blair Witch, it almost feels authentic, and the fact that just came out of nowhere is really impressive. It's awesome.
We literally all did come out of nowhere. So yeah, I mean, like we were all Ed was living in Maryland, and the rest of us were living in Orlando, Florida, in complete obscurity at the time. So,
well, a lot of the best projects come out of that. So,
yeah, no, I mean, it was a lot of fun. It's funny because when I worked on that, like a year earlier, I had worked on a movie that David Pryor produced called The Pack, the P period, A period, C period, K period. It was like one of the last things I did makeup on. And to me, they both are kind of the same, a very similar experience. Only The Pack, it didn't turn out as well. I don't want to say anything negative about it, but it's like, it's a $65,000 monster runs amok in the woods movie, and a really cool guy named Brian Todd directed it. But both movies were like summer camp. On both we were like all crashing around someone's house. And like making a movie, and just kind of living and breathing the movie we were making with everyone around us. And I kind of it was weird because I'd worked on a few lower budget, but like upper $100,000s of dollars budget movies, and then I worked on those two, and it was like, oh, you can actually have a lot of fun. Like it doesn't have to feel like all business all day long, and and obviously Blair Witch. I think when Greg Hale who's the producer on it, when he first pitched me the basic idea, I fell for it hook, line, and sinker like everyone else did. And I sort of feel like the pitch of that movie just worked it worked individually, and like what worked on me ended up working on a lot of other people. Like I feel like an early fan of it myself.
What turned you on to horror specifically?
I have always been into horror. I mean, like, since I was a little kid. I mean, the first movie that ever, like, really, really scared the crap out of me was Peter Medek's The Changeling with George C. Scott, which I saw on HBO, I think, when I was, like, 9 years old, and it freaked me out, and my mother had to stay up all night with me and whatever.
That's such a good movie.
Even, like, just, like, the ball bouncing down the staircase was just super creepy. I watched that movie recently on Shudder, and I mean, like, obviously, like you go like, oh, today you could do so much more with audio or whatever, but that movie really holds up quite well, and it's some great work. But and then there was like because I grew up in Orlando, out of Tampa, there was like one of those horror shows from a guy named like one of those horror host characters, and it was Dr. Paul Bearer, and they would show like a lot of like old William Castle kind of stuff, and I got like way into that stuff, but I feel like the movie that really hooked me when I was a teenager was Fright Night, the original Fright Night, and I taped that off of cable, and I just watched it over and over and over and over again. Tom Holland's movie, and it's probably somewhere between that and The Thing. Romantically, I'd like to say it was The Thing because I had seen The Thing and I had taped it, but I feel like The Thing to me is like bigger than a horror movie. Movies like The Shining and The Thing are like just they transcend genre in a weird way. And to me, Fright Night is like a straight up like Saturday night horror movie that I just loved, and I watched it 1,000 times. And even I was just a few years ago super nerded out because I got to work with Tom Holland for literally only a few hours, but he's in one episode of 20 Seconds to Live. And it was like the most exciting thing to me ever to like be able to communicate with him,
So you may have already answered that. Then would Fright Night be your favorite horror movie?
No, I mean, I think I would have to say The Thing. I mean, I guess it feels like 10 years ago I would talk about The Thing and nobody knew what it was. And I feel like The Thing has had a cultural renaissance, and now everybody is aware of it, which isn't me like saying like, hey, I was into the thing before it was cool. But
So hipster of you, Ben.
well, like when I was making Alien Raiders is very much an homage to the thing. Like as much as I was able to do for basically no money. We had a pretty low budget. But I remember talking to our sound designer and saying like, have you ever seen the thing? And he was a younger guy and he'd never heard of it. So I had it on DVD and I lent it to him. And I don't know if that made any difference in his sound design, but to me, like that movie is just such a seminal, amazing. Like there's no other movie like it.
So true. I adore the thing.
And Kurt Russell in it is just fantastic.
Yeah, and John Carpenter firing on all cylinders. I mean, John Carpenter's made some amazing films, but to me, that combines everything he does well in one package.
Yeah, it's definitely the height of his powers.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about this a little bit before the podcast, how it might be a little bit tricky to pin this down, but what would you say the scariest horror movie you've seen is?
God, I mean, because to me, it's like the way that I kind of think about what is scary is like what gets under my skin and what like kind of haunts me. And it's not super recent, but it's more recent than the thing. I guess, and people would say it's not even a horror movie, but I feel like Pan's Labyrinth has some of the scariest imagery that just like really at the time just really got way under my skin. I saw that movie I think 3 times in the theater. I mean, there are movies like The Witch recently, which I loved, but when I say it scared me, it's not like it's more just a creeping dread than a scare, but I love that movie.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and Pan's Labyrinth has such a great mix of the supernatural horror, but also the visceral, real horror.
Yeah.
It just sticks with you for days after watching it. Pan's Labyrinth is one of my favorite movies, and I know it's one of Nathaniel's as well. We both love that thing.
Yeah, I mean, I love Guillermo del Toro, but that's definitely I wish he would. I wish he would try and make that every time, but obviously, he's his own guy. So
yeah, he has such a interesting range, but when he goes that direction, he hits that out of the park.
I look forward to everything he does, and I don't think that there's a single movie of his that I don't love. I think that above all of his English language films, I would put Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone both right up there, though.
Agreed.
That's fair. So, should we dive into talking a little bit about Video Palace, since that's your...
Yes.
Do it up.
I'd gotten an unmarked white videotape the week before, and I watched a few minutes. And it was like some kind of experimental video from the 70s, like Guy Sherwin on crack or something. All static and noise and barely discernible moving shapes. Sometimes you'd make out a dark form, but then the static would overtake the frame. And I haven't thought about it since, but... listen to this.
Oh my goodness. So I gotta say, Ben, Nathaniel told me about Video Palace. I was traveling in Tennessee this last week. And he said, hey, there's this new podcast. You gotta check it out. And I was very excited. I was kind of going through a podcast drought. I listened to all 10 episodes in 2 days.
Wow. Thank you. That's like 3 hours.
It is brilliant.
Oh, thank you.
So brilliant.
I also listened to it in 2 days.
Oh man,
that's great to hear.
Like dive into it. So tell us a little bit how you guys created the story, and Nathaniel, maybe we should give a little teaser out to our listeners about what this is about.
Or I guess maybe we're the less qualified people to talk about what it's about. Do you want to give us a little snapshot, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, kind of the way that we've always talked about it is it's a first-person investigative podcast, like a serial or in the dark kind of podcast, in which our narrator, who we are crazy glued to for the duration, goes to investigate something that starts off seeming kind of interesting and benign and ends up being a horrible Lovecraftian style, cult conspiracy cover up. Like he kind of goes down a crazy rabbit hole into Lovecraft comes up a lot. So sorry, that's not a good elevator pitch, but it's later for me. So,
Video Palace being this kind of central location that had a bunch of old VHSs,
Yeah, Video Palace itself. I mean, like so much of it is stuck to nostalgia for older media, and it does all center around like a video store in Vermont that burned down in the '90s. That was like this place that you could get literally anything,
including these very mysterious white tapes.
Yes, the white tapes, and we tried to create we have a whole mythos around the white tapes that we only touch on in the podcast. But yeah, these white tapes, which cause our hero Mark Cambria, played by Chase Williamson of John Dies at the End fame, that make him speak in a language that doesn't really exist in his sleep, and that kind of kicks off our mystery.
Yeah, so if you haven't listened to it just from that teaser, pause this, go listen to the whole show, and then come back. I guarantee all our listeners will love it.
We have a kind of a groupie who works with me, and I let her know about it, and she also finished it in a day.
Oh, wow.
So it's catching fire. It's a fantastic podcast.
I hope we get to do a second season. We'll
you better do a second season. Or I will riot.
Or at least tweet very angrily.
Do it.
Both.
Give me a stern tweet.
Okay.
So one of my things that I really was drawn to with Video Palace was the voice acting in this podcast blew my mind. It was incredible. Can you maybe give some insight on how you guys figured that out?
Yeah. So I have a podcast that I've been doing for a while. That's just an interview-based podcast, like the one that we're doing right now, where I interview cinematographers. But I've never done like professional audio production like this. And I'm a filmmaker first and foremost, and I kind of approached it as a filmmaker. So the conventional wisdom about like if you're going to record a narrative podcast would be, bring in each actor individually, have them read all their lines, and maybe as a director you stand off in the booth and read the other lines that they have to lead in, and then in editing you cut them all together. Or if you have a scene between two actors, you might have them both in like isolated booths doing the scenes, so you can slide their audio around. And what I kind of said from the beginning was I didn't want to do that. I wanted to basically do everything like it was live theater or like it was a film scene. So we were recording in a Foley studio in Burbank. So it's, not the biggest room in the world. It's, probably like the size of the average living room. And we had really expensive mics on their bodies, and we had a really expensive boom mic, but we also gave Chase a Zoom H4n, which is a device that you would probably use to record an actual podcast with. And we would block the scene. So if they're walking, we'd have them walking in place. If they were seating, if they were in the first scene, they're in bed, and we put ferny pads down and pillows, and they're literally laying down. We darkened the room and tried to create the mood. As we didn't spend hours with this because we had to record very quickly. But the scene work is just like scene work in live theater or film, where you just kind of go through it a few times and you have them physicalize as much as humanly possible. We had them do whatever physical task they were doing. And we always thought, like, where would he have put the microphone if he's, interviewing Amber in her trailer? Where's the microphone? Does he put it on the table? Is he holding it in his hand? If he's holding it in his hand, Chase would literally hold the thing and point it around. And I feel like that gave us a great sense of realism, and it didn't slow us down. We were able to record really quickly. We recorded, about 3 hours of stuff, and we did it in about 5 days. So it was a really fast process. And also for the interviews, I used a technique that we had. I don't know that I invented it. All I know is no one ever taught me how to do it. I kind of figured it out on my own. When we were doing the Blair Witch specials, like Curse of the Blair Witch, instead of like scripting an interview saying like, so where did you go to blah, blah, blah. And then they say, I was 15 and whatever. Instead of giving them scripted answers, what I do is I write up a bio that's like maybe 2 pages long, and it goes into interesting details or whatever. And then we encourage actors to elaborate as much as they feel like elaborating. And so every interview is a real interview. So, if it's scripted, most of them scripted wise are only maybe 3 pages at most, which means you'd have about 3 minutes of material from them. But in our case, we'd end up having sometimes 30 minutes of material from people. when we brought in Adam Green to play himself, Adam had like he went into a whole giant yarn, and it was fascinating. And I was like, God damn, Adam, we need to make you a co-host of this podcast now. But and in fact, his interview was so awesome, and this is all because Adam's awesome. I went to Shudder and said, like, hey, some of the interviews of the real people are really fascinating. Could we do some bonus episodes? And they went for that. So we just cut longer versions of all the interviews with the real people, him and Steve Barton, Sam Zimmerman. They were all great. And so they're like, it's a Shudder only thing, but they released those bonus episodes. And to me, that stuff, all the interviews were like that though. So any character who, Jacob Manders or whoever, like Chase is literally in the same room with them interviewing them, and they're just babbling. And what you get from that is sort of like you have to chop it down to make it work. And I did a lot of the actual editing of the interviews. And in the act of chopping it, it just ends up sounding like a real interview, because that's what would have happened to a real interview. You kind of, Frankenbite what people say and stuff like that. And, like obviously we could say to the actors, say it just like this, but really Bob DeRosa, who co-wrote it with me, he and I were in the room just making sure that they got like the correct information out. And in the bios, especially when people are talking about, so like a bunch of the characters talk about Video Palace, but I gave them all different information about Video Palace, sometimes mildly conflicting, because I feel like that's what would happen in real life. Like if, all of us were describing Salt Lake City, I've been there a couple of times, and I would have conflicting descriptions from both of you. Mm-hmm. And that's just the normal, way people are. So we kind of build that into the bios as we're writing those. So it's that. And also, honestly, we have an amazing casting director who I've been working with since 2003 named Leah Mangum. And she knows the kind of actors that I'm looking for. And she's great at finding people who are good and good at improv. And we encourage them, even though the whole thing is scripted, we did encourage them to improv. And a lot of times, if it was like a scene with Mark and Tamara, I would ask, Chase and Devin, who played those two roles, I would say like, hey, could you give me the 10 seconds before the scene starts? Could you just ad-lib something? And knowing that like we might be fading the music up or something, and you just want to hear them talking, sometimes they'd give us amazing stuff. Or Anina Denovi, who plays Kat, really has a degree in music. And so when we were talking about the tritone, that the devil's tone and all that stuff, yeah, she knew a lot about that, and she elaborated. She went off of our script and went into more detail than we'd written. And Bob and I were in the room like, shit, we got to use that.
Well, I need to hear that recording.
Yeah, she was pretty amazing. Yeah, I mean that was. I mean, I can run my yap about the way that we work with actors a lot, because to me, like, that's at the center of this is like, getting the script as good as we could, which had to happen very quickly, and then getting actors who could be authentic. And we would tell people in the auditions, and like literally Bob and our producer Liam Finn and I and Leah Mangum were sitting in every audition, like literally every audition. And we would say to the actors, like, I don't care if you butcher the script, like, we're looking for authenticity. And we ended up getting actors who didn't butcher the script, but were great at being authentic. But in the audition, it was like, we just wanted to know that they sounded like real people.
It's amazing how often that can be a problem with especially scripted podcasts. And yeah, I never felt like at any point it didn't feel natural. So you definitely nailed it there.
Well, and that level of authenticity makes me want to watch or listen to the show again, because where I know that this is an actual interview, it kind of adds another level to it almost. That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's a fun technique. And, again, like we used it on Curse of the Blair Witch and the Burkittsville 7 and Shadow of the Blair Witch. And I also did a TV special for the first Hellboy movie that Guillermo del Toro directed in 2004. Used the same exact technique every time. And I feel like you get pretty amazing results. And again, like I'm not saying I invented it, but I don't know anyone else who's ever done it. So maybe there's another version of it someone does that's better, but it's what I know works.
Well, you do a pretty damn good job as is.
Oh, thanks.
So one thing I'm just kind of wanting to know is kind of like how you got involved in the project, because it's not your name as listed as like the creator of the show, but you're the director and co-writer. So I kind of want to know, how you got into this project, especially since it was kind of a departure from you working on film.
So Mike Manello was the one who brought me on, and Mike was the co-producer of the Blair Witch Project, and Mike was sort of the person who was most directly responsible, I think, for putting the Blair Witch stuff on the internet in the early days, and Mike he's like next level brilliant marketing guy, and he has an agency in New York called Campfire, where they do kind of experience-based advertising. Sometimes they use the web. Sometimes they, like last year at Comic-Con, they did a pop-up store for The Purge that was like Party City, but it was Purge. I think it was Purge City, selling Purge products. Like Mike is just like really one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. And so he had met with Owen Shiflett, who is the executive at Shudder, and he had this idea. He and a guy named Nick Braccia, who also works at Campfire with Mike, and Owen had liked the idea, and so they'd kind of gone off and developed a basic pitch and kind of like a 5-6 page, maybe 10 page outline. So when Mike approached me to see if I would be interested in doing it, that was pretty much what they had, and I immediately saw, I got what he was going for. And Mike and I had been talking for years, like maybe the last 3 or 4 years, about doing for fun, doing like a fiction horror podcast, or a fiction, maybe not horror, but like a, dark, weird ass, like what we do kind of but as a podcast. We've been talking about, because I'm obsessed with podcasts and I subscribe to a scandalous number of them. And so does Mike. And so we've been talking about it for a while. So he brought the idea to me, and it was the kind of thing where, like, he's full-time at his agency. He would not have the time to develop it any further than he already had. And the same with Nick. Those guys both work full-time at that. And so, they're the two creators of it, and they're the executive producers of it. And like every step of the way, we kind of showed them our math and kind of got their blessing before we moved on to the next thing, whatever it was. And so, we took their outline, and I looked at their outline after we finished it, and I was like, without meaning to, we really stuck pretty close. I mean, there were some significant changes that we had to make along the way, and I would say we also really worked hard to make Tamara a much bigger character. And where it goes with Tamara was definitely that was our idea, but we stuck really close to their outline and all the themes and stuff that they wanted to have in there. And then just I brought Bob on, not just because Bob and I have worked together. We haven't just worked together on 20 Seconds to Live. Bob and I do lots of like goofy ass late night theater and stuff in LA, and we collaborate on all kinds of stuff. And we've developed a few films to try to get made, and it's brutal business and stuff doesn't get made. So I brought Bob on because he had a lot of TV experience as a writer, and I knew that we were going to need to kind of break it like television. We were going to need to go episode by episode and follow the arcs of every character, and I honestly didn't really know how to do that. If it was one thing, if it was like Curse of the Blair Witch or something like that, if it was a format that I understood better, I would have maybe had more confidence. But I wanted to work with Bob on it, and Bob and I have I think complementary skills as creative people. Ordinarily, he does the writing and I do the directing, but in this case, we both did the writing, and it was literally sitting in his home office with cork boards and index cards, writing out ideas for scenes and moving them around and shuffling them around until we felt like we had each episode. And then we ran all that by Mike and Nick, and then when we got their blessing, we took our cork boards literally to Shudder and pitched Owen and Nick Lazo, who's the other main executive on it, and kind of ran them through every episode, beat by beat, and pitched them the whole season. Then when we got the blessing, that was when the writing started. Yeah, I mean that was how I came to be involved in it. And for any prospective season 2 stuff, again, like I can't break any news here about what's happening with that, but the identical team is still working on trying to get season 2 to happen.
We as a podcast are praying for, because I need to know what happens next.
Oh, it gets much worse. Anyway,
we will be marketing the shit out of this episode or this season 2 if it comes to like grief. Something that I really loved is the story itself. You know, it kind of harkened back to that nostalgia for a lot of us millennials with the VHS and the clamshells and all of this. But also the story was incredibly original, I thought. And the way you guys kind of describe the story, you have no idea what the white tapes are, what they're really doing. Even in the final episode, you're clueless. You know, you don't know if it's aliens or demons or these Lovecraftian old gods, or even if time travel is involved. Was that challenging to kind of, you know, you knew what was going on, but you kind of have to mask it and make it a little more vague?
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is that we kind of set up front, like, you know, I think about the original, you know, Richard Donner's The Omen. You know, the scene where the church steeple kind of falls down and impales Gregory Peck, and I was like, we can't really have any scenes like that. Like the what's working against you if you're making something that's supposed to be documentary, and this, I mean, you know, this bedevils every found footage movie. Like, I try and be very purist about this stuff, and saying like every piece of audio has to have a source, and it's like tempting to have like, oh, the monster's standing right, you know, the eyeless man's right there, and I can, you know, point my microphone, hey, eyeless man, you know, what'd you have for breakfast? You know, like it's tempting, but it's also like you don't usually get that convenience in a documentary form. So the only times that we could really kind of, I mean, we could have 10 scenes where Mark gets his ass kicked, or, you know, he gets chased out of somewhere, or he sneaks into somewhere, but it was like really hard to like not. You can't really show the monster the way you can in a movie. And I mean, think about Blair Witch. You know, like you never see anything ever. Yeah. You never really get to see anything. And I think that, you know, to a lot of people, that's extraordinarily frustrating because, you know, like, you know, that same year Deep Blue Sea came out. We got to watch, you know, a shark bite Samuel L. Jackson in half. But, you know, or the remake of The Haunting came out, and we got to see like very brightly lit, you know, Jan de Bont scenes of, you know, ghosts and stuff. And it's like, it's a different thing when you're like, okay, I'm just not going to show you the one thing you really want. And so, you know, the discussion about like the mythology of the of Video Palace and the bigger mythology about where the white tapes come from and what they actually are is really only hinted at. And I don't know how spoilery you want me to get, but like in the last episode, when a lot is revealed, shall we say, the audio is dropping out a lot because Mark is like, he's on his phone. So, and it's uploading to a cloud thing. So he's getting crappy reception because he's in a basement. But we scripted out exactly what everyone says. Like, you know, there's a full script for what is said down there, and the actors, you know, said all of it. You just don't hear all of it. Probably the clearest indication you get as to like what's really going on is from the police tape interview with Thurman Mueller that turns up. And he talks about, you know, the 8 doors in the stack. Yeah, that's sort of the entry point to the mythology that we created.
And then Max George gets pissed off because I can't hear what's going on, so I end up listening to that section 4 or 5 times. It was fantastic. And Nathaniel, I want your opinion. What do you think is going on? Is it aliens? Is it demons?
Man, I don't know.
Yeah, but I want to know. Because I think it's demons.
I wish I could tell you.
I know, but we can't know. I'm a fan of demons, so I just want to say that.
I just want to say there is an answer, and none of us are fans of like ambiguity for ambiguity's sake, or like we feel like you can have ambiguity in the final product, but as creators, if we have ambiguity, it's going to feel kind of mushy and insubstantial. And even though like we were furiously writing this to get it, you know, because, you know, we were brought on, like I said, about a year ago. And so that my son was born on the 4th of May, and we probably started late May or early June, Bob and I breaking it and writing it. And then we had to record it in July, and then the whole thing had to be completely finished and turned in September. So, wow. So it was a super fast process, and the mythology stuff wasn't in that original document. Bob and I had to kind of come up with that. But then since, like, we kind of we knew what it was, and we made enough mythology to kind of get us through. And then when we started talking about possible season 2s, we were able to like really go in and expand the mythology a lot. So I'm hoping we get to do that because we have some shit, and I think people will like it.
Well, I can tell you in advance, we will like it. So,
and whatever we need to do to make sure there is a season 2, we will do it.
One thing I'm curious about is like where, other than Lovecraft, which you've specifically mentioned, have you kind of found inspiration for the story? It definitely feels like a lot of kind of urban legends and stuff like that. So kind of where did the things that kind of made the story work for you come in?
We talked about a lot of different influences, and I would say that a lot of mine lie in things like David Cronenberg, Videodrome, and The Fly. There's aspects when you get into the deeper mythology, especially, that kind of combine mysticism and technology in like a Jack Parsons kind of a way. And then, one of the things that I thought about a lot while we were kind of creating the narrative was The Wicker Man, because really the story is a lot like The Wicker Man in that, you have a character who believes he's uncovering things, but really he's being kind of frog marched to a specific ending that people want him to have. We also talked a lot about Clive Barker. There's a Clive Barker novella called In the Flesh, where there's a line in there about there are basically like these two characters are in jail, and there's like a dream world that they go to that's sort of a purgatory hell kind of place. And not the innocent man, but the man who wasn't into all the demonology shit in it is told at one point as he goes to this place, there are no visitors, just prospective residents. And I feel like, there's a sense in Video Palace that Mark Cambria is called to do what he does, even though he doesn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, and that's mentioned in the later episodes too.
Yeah, he's kind of got a compulsion. I feel like that myth is kind of hardwired into Clive Barker stuff, like in the Hellbound Heart,
Sure.
Yeah, It's like nobody accidentally picks up the Le Manchard configuration, or the Lament configuration as they call it in the movie. So yeah, to me that's like, there's a reason that this happens to Mark and not Tamara and not Kat, even though both of them listen to all the tapes. It really hits him. So, and then, beyond that, and actually, Owen Shiflett at Shudder was one of the people who recommended a documentary that I found on YouTube, and I think the filmmakers put it on YouTube. I don't think I'm advocating piracy of any kind, called Adjust Your Tracking, and it's about kind of the underworld of VHS collector culture. Huh. And I definitely watched that, and actually one of the people that we interview in episode 1 is Eric Spudik, who I actually knew, I guess I know Eric. And we brought him in because Eric is one of the people in the VHS subculture. He used to have a store right around the corner from my house where he sold VHS videos, and now I think he does it all online. But he has a great story in that we touch on briefly in the episode, where there's like a super rare VHS movie called Tales from the Quaded Zone, and it's highly prized. And he found it in like a thrift store for 99 cents and sold it for like over $600.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So moving aside from those types of inspirations, you have, these urban myths. The Eyeless Man to me was very much like Slender Man. Did that have any connection at all, or is that just kind of a...
Oh, yeah. Slender Man, and also the story that the little girl, that the teenage girl tells in the diner about the Eyeless Man is sort of my modification of a story that people used to tell about Aleister Crowley.
Oh, yeah.
And, there's definitely a connection to Crowley in... I wouldn't say definitely a connection, but in our mythology, let's just say it deals in Crowley-ish stuff. It's not, it's not, it's not Thelema, but it's kind of playing in that world.
Oh, totally. Now that you say that, my eyes were just like, oh my God. Yeah, that's right. Wow. Crowley's one of my unsung heroes in my life. So
yeah, he's a very interesting person. I find like he creeped the shit out of me when I was a kid. My grandmother had a book that had like all the weird 20th century people in it, like, Rasputin and stuff. And Crowley was one of them. And I remember reading about it, and it freaked me out. It wasn't until like I was probably a teenager in my 20s when I started reading Robert Anton Wilson,
Yeah.
and him kind of using Crowley as like a trickster character. And then I watched a documentary about Crowley, and I'm like, actually, I think Crowley is basically Charles Manson if no murder had been committed. Like he claimed to have supernatural powers, and he did all this stuff, and he made people do weird shit. And I just don't think he killed anybody. I don't think he killed anybody.
He
but
founded a religion. More people have done that before.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if you know the Jack Parsons story, but it's something that I've always found fascinating. That like the guy who created solid rocket fuel was obsessed with Aleister Crowley, and every time he launched a rocket, he would recite Crowley's Hymn to Pan.
I did not know that. That's awesome.
Yeah, there's 2 books. They made CBS All Access made a show about it, and I didn't have it at the time, but I do now, so maybe I should watch it. But it's an adaptation about a book called Strange Angel, and I've read 2 books about Parsons. That one, and there's another one called Sex and Rockets. And Parsons is his own crazy can of worms, because he was into Crowley and also cutting edge science, rocket science. And he died pretty young in an explosion in his garage.
I'm gonna have to read into that.
Yeah. Also, all weirdly intertwined with L. Ron Hubbard. Like, I want to watch the TV version of Strange Angel, because it's hard to tell the Parsons story without L. Ron Hubbard being the villain. And I wonder how you get away with that in Hollywood. But somebody did. I don't know. I had worked on a reboot of In Search of at one time, and we were telling the Parsons story as part of an episode, and they wouldn't let us include anything about L. Ron Hubbard. And it was but L. Ron Hubbard was all this stuff. L. Ron Hubbard is, take away any actual things about L. Ron Hubbard. And I'm not even saying L. Ron Hubbard is a villain. I'm saying in the Jack Parsons story, L. Ron Hubbard was clearly the villain.
So, aside from modern mythos and urban legend, what podcasts kind of inspired you?
I'm glad you asked, actually. The one that I was listening to while we were writing it was season 2 of In the Dark, which, if you haven't heard it, it's an amazing It's a little bit like Serial, but I was paying very close attention to the language of it, like the way that it mixed live stuff. There's a scene in season 2 where the where the host and somebody else kind of go into an abandoned prison and find the office and find files in an office. And, I was like, okay, well, that's how you kind of record that. Trying to figure out how would it sound? That was probably my number one inspiration while I was listening to it, but while I was writing it rather. But, honestly, there are just so many great podcasts. Everyone's always talking about how, podcasting is just kind of getting started, but already there are so many masterfully done, brilliant podcasts. And one of the ones that we actually looked at was Startup, the Gimlet podcast, season 1, where it's not Alex Goldman. I'm just blanking on his name, but the guy who founded Gimlet.
Alex Bloomberg.
He's trying to raise the money. Have you heard Startup?
I haven't listened to it yet, but I've heard them talk about it on Reply All, which is one I definitely listen to.
So season 1 of Startup, all the seasons of Startup are good. I think there's 3 now, but the first one is amazing because it's him trying to figure out how to raise venture capital when he basically had been working in public radio his whole life, and trying to switch, sort of not even switching his career, trying to do the same thing but in the private sector for money, and not knowing how to raise venture capital. And there are all these scenes where his wife is just really tearing the shit out of him, really not berating him, but he kind of did a warts and all thing. And I was Bob and I were kind of talking about that as a kind of a source of inspiration for us for the Mark Tamara stuff. We wanted it to be very, very raw and very, very real. And so, it's hard to, it's extremely hard to cast actors who can do what our 2 actors did. And, also given we had to do casting had to happen very quickly, but they were both, Devin and Chase were so game to just jump in and kind of do that scene work. And in episode 8, when they kind of have their giant meltdown, that was one of the scenes we gave them for their audition. And it was really interesting because we had it narrowed down to basically 4 people. And it was, when you get that close, you're like, well, any combination of these people probably would work, but it seemed pretty clear the right way to go. But we kind of patterned that after Startup season 1. There was also an episode of Reply All, and I'm forgetting which one it exactly was, that we had referenced to them because it was one of the ones that was kind of about a mystery. But it's like, how Reply All kind of bemusedly goes at a mystery. Like they're not even even the one time the guy went to India to find the guy who had tried to hack his computer and like confront him directly, like, or you're listening to it like, this guy's gonna get his ass kicked.
Yeah, I love that episode.
I couldn't put it. It was a two-parter. I couldn't put it down. I was so pissed off that I had to wait like 2 weeks for the conclusion.
Same. Well, I think we've covered a lot of the angles that we were wanting to cover. Was there anything else that you wanted to share about Video Palace or any of your other projects that you've worked on?
Well, I will say that we do have a season 2 of 20 Seconds to Live coming out. So if people like the first season, and it'll be wherever it is, it'll be free. Yeah. So 20 Seconds to Live is just kind of a personal hobby horse that Bob and I created a few years ago, and we love making them, and they're all really short, and some of them are super gross and super dark.
I did kind of want to take a moment and talk about Shudder. I've mentioned this to a few people, and they had no idea that it actually existed. Do you want to maybe give us a quick little rundown about what Shudder is and does?
Well, Shudder's like Netflix, but they're all horror movies. And I shouldn't say all horror. It's like horror, thriller, genre stuff. I feel like it's stuff that would appeal to horror fans. So you'll see a movie like Darren Aronofsky's Pie or Tony Scott's True Romance on there. Neither one of those are horror movies, but I think horror fans like those movies. I've been a subscriber for a few years now, and I love it. And it's relatively inexpensive. It's like $4 a month. And I had been trying for over a year just to get a meeting at Shudder before this happened. So I was very, very excited to work with them and kind of see the inner workings of the way it works. Because to me, I'm not trying to slag Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever, but like if you go on there, if you're into a specific genre, be it horror, sci-fi, whatever, if you look at the horror selection on Netflix, there's good, there's bad, there's indifferent, and they're all just kind of put out there with equal weight. And Amazon Prime is even worse in my opinion. There's just not a sense of curation. But like, and he's in New York, but as I understand it, Sam Zimmerman is like very, very, very hands-on involved in the curation of what goes on to Shudder. And so, like, is every movie on there like the most classic, awesomest movie ever? No, but I would say every movie that's on there is a movie that's got some kind of a fan base or, has love from a fan base. And they're chosen really, really well. And I've seen, I know if I put on Shudder and I play a movie I've never heard of before, there's a much better chance that I'm going to like it than if I was to just go on Netflix and go into the horror tab and just hit play on the first thing I saw. And I've seen a lot of stuff that I'd never heard of on Shudder and been blown away. And then like even last night, I was watching The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs. And they had a movie that I've heard of my whole life and I've never seen it. Hello, Mary Lou, Prom Night 2. Never seen it. And that movie's rip shit bonkers. I don't know that I would have watched it otherwise. And it was great having Joe Bob on there because he breaks it up and kind of talks about the making of it and who made it. And he has a lot of good information. But The Last Drive-In is kind of a limited thing. They have some original stuff. And they also have original movies on there. Like they're what I don't think they're making the movies. I think they're getting the rights to them. But like the Nicolas Cage movie, Mandy.
A fantastic one.
Yeah, and that movie also is just banana pants crazy.
Summer of '84 I thought was really good too, and that's another kind of Shudder produced, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think that what's happening is they release them. Like my friend Graham Skipper made a film called Sequence Break that got picked up by Shudder, and it's an awesome kind of send up to Cronenberg kind of a thing. It's really cool, and it also stars Chase Williamson. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what arrangement they had, but it was presented as a Shudder original, and I know Graham made it independently.
I mean, and at the end of the day, if you love horror movies, it's a great kind of app to use. It's fantastic. I've also been a subscriber for about 3 years, and I almost check it weekly for new movies that are out, and it's fantastic. Totally.
Like I'm always paying attention to the new stuff that comes on there, and I mean, and I'm often just like blown away. I mean, like I hadn't seen The Changeling I think the last time I saw The Changeling was literally on VHS. Like, I think I was in college. Then they put that up on Shudder, and I was like, hell's yeah. And I watched it, like I think like the day it was up. And, sometimes also I'll give movies another chance. Also, like a lot of times, back in the video store days, there'd be a movie that like I would see the box, but something about it would give me pause and I wouldn't rent it for whatever reason. And then, on Shudder, I'll be like, oh, Burial Ground. I wonder what that is. And then I'll watch it and be like, oh, cool. And some of them are great and some of them are terrible. I went through a binge around the time my son was born. Don't psychoanalyze me about this, but I started watching like every Italian horror movie that they had on there, which is a lot. And
Italian horror can get pretty intense.
Yeah, and it's all just super weird and dreamlike. Yeah, and it was kind of fun. And even like I'd seen a lot of the Dario Argento movies, but like I don't know, they always merit revisiting. And also there were like some Fulci ones, like I'd never seen City of the Living Dead, for instance, and having Shudder like enabled me. I mean, I'm not saying I couldn't have seen it some other way, but it just makes it too easy. Like there it is. And I'm a big fan of The Beyond, and of course I love that. I love that whole vibe that he does, and people don't make movies like that anymore. And when they try to make them like that, they fail anyway. Like they're not authentic. What's cool about those movies is they just are authentically what they are.
Yeah. I'm thinking with a new child there, it's probably just a lack of sleep. It felt like the dreamlight stuff anyway, so you just kind of related.
Man. Yes, before my son was born, I was talking to an older friend who's a parent, and I was like, "What do you do about all this terror that I have? About having, because he's my first kid." And he was like, "Oh, don't worry, the exhaustion will take care of the terror." And I was like, and he was completely right. I mean, like,
yeah,
I've only within the last like month have I actually been getting like normal sleep again.
Nathaniel has a 2-year-old and I have a 4-year-old, so we feel for you.
Yeah, you guys are way ahead of me. Yeah, my son literally just turned 1.
Well, that's exciting. And so, I guess going back to Shudder, and now they're getting into podcasts, so that's really cool too. I love seeing more, high quality genre podcasts coming out.
Well, and I think that there's a lot of people trying to crack that nut, and the truth is, and we kind of talked about it. It's like the podcast format isn't like other formats, so it's not. It bears similarities to old time radio, or it bears similarities to TV or movies. But really, the way people listen to podcasts, like we don't usually like all gather around, a Sonos speaker and listen to a podcast as a group. We listen to podcasts by ourselves. Like we're in the car, or we're working out, or we're walking our dog, or we're doing some job that doesn't require our ears or something. Like we're usually alone when we're listening to them. And so they're kind of talking directly into our heads if you're listening to them on earbuds. And so it's a very weirdly intimate format. So a lot of people are trying to crack the code of like, how do you tell other stories? And I feel like you can't infinitely tell first person fake documentaries basically like this. And Bob and I are actually developing more of a close third person style narrative. So not like third person omniscient, but like you're kind of with one person mostly, but it's a third person story. We're developing one for someone else, so we'll see how that goes. But for my money, the only narrative podcast that really cracked it well was Homecoming. In that I feel like they got the intimacy right, and they figured out how to sort of tell a cinematic narrative story using only audio. And part of it is they got like Catherine Keener and Oscar Isaac, and they got like amazing Dave Cross. They got great actors. But I've heard a lot of other strictly narrative podcasts, and it's probably just my personal taste, or maybe I'm just not inured to the style as much. But I feel like nobody nailed it quite like Homecoming in that regard. But I feel like we're going to start seeing more of them. Like I know Rami Malek is in one that recently launched. And the exact same executives that we work for at Shudder did one for Sundance Now called Exeter. There's a bunch of them out there. And I think that's only going to become more the case. And part of it's because you can create an audience. Like if you can build an audience for an idea, to use an industry buzzword for an IP. If you can build an IP using this, it's a lot less expensive and a lot more creative, frankly, than making an episode of a TV show or whatever. Like the cost of 3 hours of Video Palace is far less than the least expensive TV pilot you could ever imagine. And so, you can actually cover a lot of ground. You can see if the idea really has legs. And, like in the case of Homecoming, they remade it for Amazon, with Julia Roberts. Why Catherine Keener wasn't good enough, I don't know, but it was cool to see something go from a podcast to a TV show, and I think it even won a few Emmys and stuff. So I feel like we're going to see more and more of that stuff, because you can bring in to me, having Chase Williamson, was a giant big deal because I'm a giant fan of his. But he really only had to give us, 5 days, and that's because he's the lead. Larry Cedar, who plays Randy Wayne, who, he was on Deadwood, he was in The Crazies, he was in Twilight Zone, the movie, for God's sakes. He's one of the workingest actors I know. And Larry was only there for under 4 hours to do all the Randy Wayne stuff.
Oh, wow.
And so you can get really good, if you can get really good actors, they get to come in and have fun. It's a fun process for them. They can wear their street clothes. They don't have to shave or put on makeup or do anything. They just get to come in and act. And, for a lot of actors, that's kind of a dream.
Yeah, and I mean, it pays off. So when I listened to Video Palace, I was doing night security at a hotel.
Uh-huh.
So I was wandering long hallways alone listening to it, which was not the best decision at 3 a.m. But, it definitely got under my skin, and it was just such like you said, it was such an intimate experience while I was doing something otherwise mundane. It made it very creepy.
But they're all like that. Like S-Town, I remember listening to S-Town, and I was working on a project that was really stressing me out, and at a certain point I had to stop because S-Town got way too into my head. And, it was just such a dark, dark, dark story. And it's real, and I just never knew where the hell, what other turns that crazy ass story was going to take. And to me, like, you can do that in a novel. It's harder to do that. It's harder to do that in a movie. Like in the Dark, not to keep going back to In the Dark, there was an episode where they found somebody's name on a Post-it note on a box in a police, it was an evidence box. And they were trying to figure out who this guy was. And they spent like 20, 30 minutes of that episode chronicling them literally crisscrossing the country, going to like 3 or 4 different cities and tracking down every time who they thought was the guy. And it turned out not to be the guy each time. And I'm like, you couldn't really do that. In a movie, you could have a montage where you covered that in like 2 minutes. But a podcast can like show you the process behind it. It's kind of, what do they call it? Structuralist in that way, where like you're allowed to kind of know where everything comes from. I mean, that was like why we had the person who composed the music for the podcast to be a character in the podcast. It's like, well, this shit has to come from somewhere. And if we establish this guy hasn't made a podcast before, how would he know to do any of this stuff? So, we had to kind of create our own cast of experts. And then, I guess we probably could have not had Kat be a character in that way, but then we were like, oh, there's a great narrative application of this character to have her, like, she understands audio and she understands all this stuff about the tritone. Maybe she can help them figure shit out. And, it became its own arc.
Well,
to me, that kind of stuff gets fun.
And it humanizes the other characters in the podcast. These are real people, real stories, and the events that happen to Kat and to Tara and Mike, those can actually happen. And like we kind of have been talking about this entire episode, is you guys really were able to create an authenticity in the voice acting and also in the story that really created these deep, unsettling fears. Similar to Nathaniel, I was driving home listening to it once, and you guys were talking about the eyeless man, and I had to sage my house when I got home because I was so creeped out about it. Like, the authenticity and the visceral kind of feel to Video Palace is so well done, and is a huge testament to not only your work and your art, but also the horror behind this amazing podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. Nothing makes me happier than knowing that people enjoyed it. We put a lot of work into it in the hopes that it ends up being something people like. And you do in this business, you work on a lot of things that you have that hope for, and they don't find their audience. And so it's great that it found an audience.
Well, we will continue to try to spread the word because, like I mentioned earlier, everyone who listens to us is bound to be a the right audience for Video Palace. So, well, did you have anything else, Max?
I didn't. Ben, did you want to take a minute and maybe blurb all your social media outlets if you want to do any?
Sure.
Yeah, where can people find you?
Some shameless plugging.
Absolutely. Well, I have a website, and it's Benrock Online, because benrock.com was owned by a boating company, and it's currently unoccupied, but they won't let me have it. Anyway, so I'm benrockonline.com. There you'll find all my connections, but I'm on Facebook. I'm on Twitter at Neptune Salad. Long story. And then when I signed up for Instagram, I didn't realize Instagram was going to be around for any amount of time, so I signed up as Benjamin_Rock. Crappiest name I could have had, but there you go. But I'm on Instagram. You can see lots of pictures of my baby. I'm too old for Snapchat. Don't get it. Don't understand it. Apparently, that's a thing that people like, and I don't get it. But
I don't get it either, and I'm younger than you, so whatever.
I'm right there with you too. I have it on my phone and use it maybe 3 times a year. So
I did fire it up last week when they had kind of the gender switching filter, because I just wanted to see what I would look like. I'm like, hey, I kind of look like my sister. What do you know? It did a remarkable job of making my beard disappear. I was like, wow, that's pretty crazy. But yeah, also Facebook. I'm trying to think. Yeah, LinkedIn. All the LinkedIn fans, hit me up on LinkedIn.
All right. I think that is a wrap. Stay spooky.
Stay spooky.
Need even more Scream Kings? Here's our obligatory shameless social media plug. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at Scream Kings Pod. You could also email us at screamkingspodcast@gmail.com. Help us reach a wider audience of horror fans by leaving a review on iTunes or by sharing a link on social media. You can also support the show by going to patreon.com/screamkings. Stay spooky.